Hello and welcome to another episode of our Women in STEM series. My name is Kaylee Peel and I'm the Director of Development for the Linda Hall Library. And today our guest is Lily Chen. She's a software engineer at Garmin. Lily, welcome and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's first just talk about the trajectory, kind of at this beginning of your career journey. I understand that you went to K-State.
Yep.
What is your education background and what led you to pursuing a career with Garmin?
So my educational background, I think, is a little different from my peers. I grew up, I love puzzles, love problem solving, always have, and saw computing as just kind of a technological way of doing problem solving in puzzles. But I had, some guy friends in middle school, high school that already seemed to have a background in computing, and I thought, well, I can't go into that now. I'm so far behind. So I didn't really think that was a viable option. And going into college, I actually started off in business and computers, thinking that that might be a softer way to get into it. So I studied MIS for a year. I realized pretty early on that I wasn't as big of a fan of the business classes as I thought I'd be, and figured, you know what, if I don't just bite the bullet and switch to computing now, I never will. I'll always be wondering what if. Finally got into computing and have never regretted it. I'm very glad I did it, but kind of bummed it took me a while to get to that point of feeling confident enough to pursue it as an actual career. But fell in love with it pretty early on and was able to actually land an internship with my current company at Garmin, and it worked so seamlessly. I interviewed on the same team that I'm now full-time on.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that you bring up a couple important things that I'd like to discuss with you. First, I don't think it's abnormal that you have a nonlinear track. I think a lot of women that we've interviewed on this in this series have kind of alluded to that. For whatever reason, women are needing to be a little bit more nimble and flexible in their career journeys, and I'm glad that you found something that really fulfills you and fills up your cup. But I also think it's interesting that, well, first of all, the internship piece, those things are so important, right?
Oh, yeah.
Getting that leg up, getting that mentorship, the fact that you were able to have kind of an experimentation moment before you started full-time. I think that's really important and valuable for young people, so I'm glad you had that experience. But you kind of mentioned that in high school, the boys in your class or around you were kind of already exposed to those things. Will you talk about that a little bit more? Was that because, why is that? Is that because you didn't have the same opportunities? Do you think it is more of a kind of a gendered field within STEM? What is your experience?
Well, I think the most obvious exposure for me of this idea of feeling behind was actually in late middle school. We had we were given personal passion projects where we kind of pick our subject and kind of go with it. And a couple of the boys in my class were like, let's make a little website, and they already seemed to know what they were doing. And they let me kind of sit in, because I started asking questions, and I'm like, well, how did you know how to do that? I was like, well, we just, we do it in our free time. And so I think one of their dads kind of just exposed them to stuff like that.
Sure.
And so it was just, at least for me personally, I hadn't seen that stuff. And because I got so in my head about feeling like I was already behind, I didn't end up taking high school classes that were offered for it. And just general lack of exposure, which is interesting now to see. I'm still fairly young. I'm 23, so I'm pretty fresh out of the regular schooling system. But even from babysitting when I was in high school, the girls that I had were like, "Well, we're having STEAM nights," and I'm like, "What is that?" And they just, after school, they now have programs to be showing kids earlier on, these are your opportunities, no matter what stage you're at. And I'm like, "Well, why did I get that?" And so. Kind of seeing that now, kids are actually getting that exposure. And I think that was my biggest issue, is I just didn't see it and know that it was an option for me.
That makes sense. I think it is crazy. I mean, you're in your early 20s. I'm in my early 30s. It's crazy that just a couple generations ago, we weren't having intentional exposure to these sorts of things. And it's still it sounds like it's still girls that are younger than you that are having more experiences and more intentionality. I'm glad that we have more of those experiences, but it's really kind of a stark difference between some of the things that we were all exposed to. So thanks for sharing that. So how does that kind of go into the work that you're doing now? Because I know for software engineers, for example, I know that in a lot of other fields within STEM, women are becoming more balanced when it comes to representation. Like architecture, for example, there's a lot more women, particularly in the Kansas City region. But software engineering across the country, it's still 25% are women.
Yeah.
So are you seeing that kind of in your day-to-day? How does that play out in the Kansas City region for you?
Oh, I've seen exactly that. I actually, in college, I was in a STEM sorority, and I was the only computer science major and had been the only computer science major for probably half a decade in our sorority. And we had a good number of architects. We always have a heavy set of science side, biology, and all that. And I think it is just kind of exposure things. Like a lot of software engineers stereotypes are like smelly boy, which is just not true anymore. And so I feel like a lot of women kind of shy away from that. But also too, when you see that heavy, not dramatic, like 1-to-3 male ratio, you're going to feel less inclined to go into that, because you're like, oh, well, if I'm not going to have some of the female relationships I usually seek out daily, maybe that's not going to be something I'm comfortable in. And even in my classrooms, like my graduating class there's 2 women. I was one of 2, which I didn't think much of until somebody was like, oh, wow, like, so are you like best friends with the only other female? And it's like, oh, you just assume that we're all kind of like packed together. And we do for that support, which is great. Yeah. But also it's just kind of weird that, you know, we weren't included because some of the guys just assumed, you know, we're doing our own thing. And because of that, we kind of had to. And I think that just kind of perpetuates some of that isolation that women are getting in some of the STEM fields. But I've definitely seen a little bit of a change, I think, in terms of, like we've already kind of discussed within generations, more women are getting exposure. And so by the time I was kind of finishing up my college career in computer science, I started TAing for some classes, and they're just seeing more women in each individual class was kind of nice to see. But I think the issue, at least from what I've seen from computer science, is a lack of retention. You know, we get those women in the fields, we get them interested, and then we treat them differently in the classroom, we treat them differently in the field, and then they feel isolated. And they're like, well, I'm not going to want to do this forever if I'm always going to feel like other.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's probably the biggest thing I've seen, and why it's from, at least from the computer science and tech perspective, of why we don't have that increase of women from the last several years.
So how, in your opinion then, since you are kind of freshly entering your career now, how do we combat that? Because I know obviously we expect the women who are in those roles to step up and kind of be the champion or the leader in those situations, but we can't expect just the few women who are doing that to take that load as well. What would you suggest when it comes to building more allyship with your male counterparts? Like, have you kind of explored that? What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing I actually think that that K-State, my university, did really well is that we had a Women in STEM club that wasn't just for women. It was for everybody, but the main focal point was making sure women felt supported. And so we made a big deal about, like, bring your male buddies to things when you can and make it a fully inclusive. We don't want to have, you know, people in STEM and just separate women in STEM. You know, it's just all of us can be advocates for women in STEM. It doesn't have to be just women stepping up for themselves. And I think that emphasis, seeing that as a student, was huge for me, at least. And at Garmin, we kind of have a similar thing where we have different, like, business groups that are focused on individual communities we have, but are also inviting to people who wouldn't necessarily say they identify with that community.
That makes sense. Kind of like BRG groups.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I guess what would you like to see? It can be a national thing, more global, but it could also be local and regional. What are ways that we could really be stepping up in the next few years, us outside of BRG groups and kind of that intentionality within a school or a company? Is there something we could be doing more holistically?
I think that's a great question, and something that a lot of, you know, community leaders are thinking about themselves. You know, we've got things that we think are working, but it's hard to really tell, because, like, the idea of women in STEM and really advocating for women in STEM is still pretty young, still pretty fresh, you know, like pushing that forward. It's kind of hard to see what's working, what's maybe not working as well. So I think it's kind of hard to say right now, but as we kind of progress into the future, really emphasizing things that we see to work, exposure being a huge thing. And I think for me, like, having more actual mentors in fields would be great. And it's kind of hard to do that now because, at least from the computing perspective, I don't have a lot of senior women that I see daily, like, at all. I think I've got 1 or 2 in my immediate chain, and so having a female mentor wasn't even an option. So being able to, like, progress further, if I can help be that for somebody else, that'd be great. And as we kind of continue forward, like, it kind of sucks that women are having to go out of their way to make sure other women are comfortable. But I think if we can get that first round going and make it the norm, I think that's what we really need.
Yeah, we don't have the luxury, I guess, to just kind of sit quietly and,
Right.
and wait for it to happen,
Yeah,
right?
not right now, at least.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like mentorship and advocacy is in your future. What else do you think that you kind of mentioned your career so far, or maybe that entry point into your career has been nonlinear? Do you think you'll stick with computing and software engineering, or do you think that there will be some other nonlinear tracks that you'll take in the future?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that more. Like we both know, I'm pretty young in the field, so I'm perfectly content, at least right now, to continue to see, how far I can go on the track that I am. But I love working with people. I liked working in education, the brief bit that I did, and so I think my future eventually holds doing some form of either education in computing or just working more on the business side of computing, just so I get some more of that human interaction, just because that's something I enjoy.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, last question. So the future state. So let's just say all the things that we've talked about, we just gold stars. We get it all taken care of. What do you think the future of women in STEM, women in computing specifically, looks like on a regional level, but also larger than that?
I think the future of having a quote unquote women in STEM, I think, and this may sound kind of weird, ideally like doesn't exist, Like we don't have to say, oh yes, women in STEM. It just becomes we all appreciate everyone in STEM, and because we have such a great representation of women and other ethnic minority groups, and it just becomes a bigger holistic community. I think that for me would be the ideal, that we don't have to go out of our way to think, oh, because we need to pull up this other group, we're all just even. I think that'd be the ideal.
That makes sense. I'm also hoping for that. I think that people like you and the roles that you have, that'll really take us there. So I'm really excited that you are where you are. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me
Yes,
today.
for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Lily.